Yo. So just a few things. When they get to Berlin, like we see Matt, impulsive, just carelessly spewing information that should be confidential. And they're sitting in a bath, and he's just talking to this guy about trolls. And like everybody's trying to stop him, and he's just not listening. So it does seem like there's this growing tendency for Matt to sort of be beyond control. He's not listening. And we're seeing him learn to like not listen. It takes Lon to come in and pretty much look at him and be like, dude, with a look, like, I'm gonna kill you if you keep talking. And then he backs down. And there were some interesting scenes in Berlin. One of the scenes just that I really liked was where Matt just is walking with Rand, and he just sees these white cloaks, and he's like, oh, hold on, Rand, I got an idea. And this was cool because it's so in line with his personality. And I liked it because it was sort of removed from the plot. It doesn't necessarily carry the plot forward. I mean, I guess there are aspects of it that do, but it was just a character scene. And right, he pulls out his slingshot. Everyone from Two Rivers is a professional slingshot. Everyone. So he hides and he knocks these barrels out of a cart with his slingshot, and the barrels roll down. They splash mud all over the white cloaks. So now the white cloaks are soiled. They see Rand laughing. And this is one of the first scenes where we see Rand going crazy. He, for a moment, considers, pulling out, unsheathing his sword, and just attacking. And he keeps himself in line. So afterwards, 98 will show up. And I would say ultimately she does have a very deep reservoir of sympathy and empathy when the time is right, especially for her friends from Eamon's Field. And there's a point where she loosens up around the Eamon's Fielders when they're all dancing, and she's smiling, and they're having a good time. But I think she feels slightly unbound from tradition, being so distant from her hometown. And it was a pretty good scene. And we learn that the women circle back in Two Rivers might frown upon 98 actually opening up and dancing. So this is sort of a moment where it seems like she's throwing off the rules. We see Egwene, where she earlier had the braid that signified the coming of age. She's now, it's unbraided now. And Rand picks up on this, and it frustrates him when he sees it, even though earlier he saw the braid as a viper. But he does get over this very quickly. And I think in some way they seem the same. They're both sort of bound by traditional rules, but ultimately they're lax within. So they're chased out of town by white cloaks, and then once again, immediately, savage troll goons pursue. There's a point where they engage, and there's a skirmish that results. In one instance, Matt starts hollering in another language. And this is kind of that idea of history as the past, as resurgent, as always sort of present. I think it kind of wraps up with this idea of the cyclical time, right? It's sort of in his blood to do this, which might not be a good argument, because I suppose that then any aristocrat in this world could then use the bloodline as justification for their leadership and their class system. And then as they're fleeing, they end up in an old, ancient, abandoned city, or seemingly abandoned city of Shadar Logoth. There's this ancient evil that resides in this ancient city. And Matt, against all sane advice, and also Perrin and Rand, they're pretty much implicated in this crazy scheme too. They go exploring on their own, which is just obviously stupid. Like, it when you're reading it. But they go explore, and they're led by this person into these ruins, and he's luring them in. There's all this treasure. And they investigate. Matt takes a dagger, once again, against all sane advice. Even Rand and Perrin know not to do this. They're like, leave it. And he's like, okay. But he doesn't. And I would honestly be interested to know, what led him to do it? Was it just because he's so impulsive, he just disregards rules and he didn't care, or what? But it messes him up for the rest of the book. It corrupts him. One interesting takeaway from this, I did start to get a sense of maybe who Matt's becoming. And I don't know, I'm just speculating. This is all conjecture, but it seems like we've seen Matt. He's very mischievous. He likes to play pranks. He's got this puckish attitude. He's impulsive, but he also tends to, like in the first scene with Rand, when Rand's unloading barrels, he sneaks up on him. So I do wonder if he's kind of got this deceptive, sneaky attitude, and now he has acquired this shadowy dagger. If this is sort of foreshadowing for him becoming some sort of an assassin later. So after all this, what happens is the trolls invade Shadar Logoth, and the whole party disperses. So it disperses into 3 different groups. And so here, I just wanted to point one thing out. Once again, this review / analysis is pretty long. I really had to fixate on more specifics because it just will be too sprawling without that. So I'm going to do Rand and Matt first because they're traveling with Tom. Matt, he's acquired this dagger and he's being corrupted. So he's starting to have moments where he lashes out or he becomes aggressive, and he's really depreciating into this dark mental state. And then in the case of Rand, his is mostly, I would say, plot driver too. We don't really get to see too much of his like stubborn nature because they have a difficult, very arduous journey. As Matt is being corrupted, Rand is sort of forced to keep him in line, but at the same time, he's going insane because it turns out he's using the One Power. So all the moments of luck that occur around Rand are actually him summoning the One Power, casting magic. So one of the first scenes we get with Matt, Rand, and Tom, Rand is going crazy, right? He's climbing up on the mast of this ship and he's doing all these like gymnastics up there, like some kind of circus performer. And he's a man and he can conjure magic, and this is because he's starting to go crazy. It's starting to have side effects as they're sailing away from Shadar Logoth. Once again, Tom comes across very shrewd, very, very calculating. And he was paying very close attention to like the mutterings of the crew, and it seemed like he was preventing a mutiny. And then one thing about Rand is that he constantly worries throughout from pretty much this point on to the end of the book about who he is. And I kept thinking, why? Like, it seemed a bit far-fetched that this thought about not being Tam's son, rather than the trauma of surviving the slaughter of the trolls. Like, how do I move on after this? And I thought if he had thought something like that, it would have coincided a little better with this idea of being a child versus being an adult. Like, now he has to really learn to cope with these things. Like, he has to accept responsibility. But for the most part, their story is relatively straightforward. And there were some good scenes, like where there's a scene where Rand falls off the wall and meets the queen's daughter, Elaine. And like, that was a cool scene. But for the most part, Rand and Matt's story is relatively straightforward until the end of the story. And then the next character I had some thoughts on was Nynaeve. So one thing I wondered is if Nynaeve's just meanness is in part due to her going insane from so often using the One Power. She's grown to detest the Aes Sedai. She's grown to detest the use of the One Power. And this is reflected in a lot of her statements. There's one point in chapter, I believe, 21, where she says, "Light burn her," referring to Moiraine, using the power like an Aes Sedai, a filthy dark friend Aes Sedai. She tells Rand in chapter 16 at one point, "Aes Sedai are not to be trusted, Rand." And I did wonder if some of her animosity comes from the fact that she must now become an Aes Sedai. She must learn to use the One Power. What she called it, like listening to the wind, it's not what she thought it was. It's this completely different thing that she really doesn't have the control over that she thought she did. And in fact, it has to do with the Aes Sedai, right? An institution and a guild or whatnot that she detests. And ultimately, it seems like it comes down to this choice. Become an Aes Sedai, something that she absolutely despises, or suffer a terrible death. Right? I think it goes against all of her upbringing. She's being forced to change. And I felt like there was a line in chapter 21 after the whole party has dispersed into these 3 groups, and Nynaeve is reunited with Lan and Moiraine, when she's thinking about potentially having to leave Egwene behind because the 3 boys are so important, being wrapped up as they are with Tavern. She thinks this: light. A wisdom is supposed to look after all of her people. Why do I have to choose like this, right? She has to make the choice to leave Egwene behind. And so it seems like one thing that's happening to all these characters, but especially here, Nynaeve in particular, like she's having to make these choices that she's never had to make. Right? She has to potentially leave Egwene behind. Just like she's potentially, in order to survive these trials ahead, has to become an Aes Sedai, this thing that she detests, the thing that she hates. And I think Nynaeve is learning that things aren't just so simple. There's another point when the stag and the lion is burned down after they flee Berlin, where Nynaeve's mad at Moiraine. She wishes she would have done more. But Moraine's just kind of like, what else could we have done? Ruined our chances at fighting the Dark One? And Nynaeve just doesn't like this. She wants these kind of, sometimes it seems like certain answers to difficult problems, and there just aren't any. And I think being forced into this position of having to not only travel with Moiraine and travel with Outlanders, as she refers to them, just builds the bitterness in her. There's this striking highlight between Nynaeve and Egwene is that I don't think Nynaeve ever once practices. She doesn't ever once try to train and learn to channel this power. Egwene does all the time. Nynaeve might be somewhat jealous of Moiraine. At least the way I thought about it was Nynaeve formerly had a position of respect, position of authority and prestige. And she had this power and a uniquely privileged occupation that only some are special enough to have. But that was all in this very localized world. And when she steps out of Two Rivers into the world at large, every bit of that sort of dissolves. And you get the sense that she's sort of off balance. She's lacking. She constantly tries to give advice to Moiraine, even though it's not that useful. And I think Moiraine plays the part in the whole world that Nynaeve played in this localized Two Rivers. And I get the sense that she's jealous of Moiraine, but that's also why she sort of lashes out and acts so aggressive. And I think I also get the sense that Nynaeve just had this very traditional attitude. She has this anti-foreigner attitude. I think it's definitely represented in her animosity for Moiraine. Just the comment she makes, like I said earlier, about the Aes Sedai. Filthy dark friend Aes Sedai. And then there are just a few other scenes. For instance, she's talking to Rand in chapter 16, and she tells Rand about Moiraine. She says it's none of any Outlander's business. And then there's another point where, once again, she kind of comes across with this anti-foreigner attitude. How dare the village gossip in front of an Outlander? And that was in chapter 21. She's been forced out of the world that she knows into the world sort of the Outlander. Alright, and I think that's where I'm going to end this second one. These first two, I lost control of. They kind of became a little more sprawling than I thought. I didn't really know exactly what I was doing. A lot of it felt like summary. I guess there was some review. There was some attempts at analysis. I'm going to do two more, so a third and a fourth one. And I think that'll be a little more tight, much more heavily focused on the analysis. And that's also why I skipped Perrin and Egwene, because they're going to be the focal point of the third and the fourth video. And I think theirs was just a lot more. There's a lot more to grasp onto in terms of analysis, a lot more subtle characters, a lot more themes going on, and just some interesting turns in morality. So yeah, I guess that's where I'll end this one for now.